welcome back to this panel now, which is on enterprise automation. I hope you had a really good time in the sessions that were just on, and I'm here now with three wonderful panelists. But first of all, I'd just like to give you all a little bit of context into what we're going to be talking about, just about 30 seconds worth of context. In this session on enterprise automation, what we're going to be discussing are the challenges and opportunities that exist for enterprises around the world as they automate an increasing number of their processes that were previously mediated by humans. What do we mean when we say an automated enterprise? What we mean are the internal and external processes and products, and also services that are currently being digitized, in this case, by artificial intelligence. That is for the purpose of gaining greater efficiencies, greater productivity, profitability, job satisfaction, and much more. As I mentioned in my talk previously, the vast majority of governments around the world have either considered or are in the process of implementing some kind of AI program. What we'll discuss on this fantastic panel are some of the most pressing challenges and most prescient innovations that have come to the fore when discussing responsible AI at the enterprise level. So just to reintroduce myself, so my name is Dr. Lawrence Ampofo. I'm the head of growth at the AI Responsibility Lab. I'm also joined on this panel by Ilana Golbin, who's Director of Responsible AI at PwC. Also by Navdeep Gill, who's the lead data scientist and team lead for Responsible AI at H2O.ai. And also Katya Klinova, who's head of AI, labor, and the economy at the Partnership on AI. So I'd like to welcome all three of you to this panel today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So I've given you all just a very brief introduction, but I wonder if we can just go around the room first of all and just if we can give the audience a bit of a deeper introduction into yourselves and your work, and in particular, what has really led you to be working in this space of responsible AI, but also within the enterprise. Ilana, I wonder if we can start with you.
Of course, and thank you so much again for having us, Lawrence. Very excited to be here with such wonderful panelists as well. My journey to responsible AI, I think, follows probably something very similar to other individuals. I'm first and foremost a data scientist. I've been a practicing data scientist for just about a decade. And about 5 years ago, I started working with some clients. I worked for PwC. We're a very large consulting and auditing and tax professional firm. And some of our clients were asking us, as we were building AI and machine learning applications for them, ultimately how the governance of these systems needs to change and adapt so that they can keep pace. Primarily thinking about data governance practices, thinking about model risk management in the context of banks, so on and so forth. And the community, the machine learning community at that time, was also thinking about explainable AI and other such topics. So as a result of that and just various other interests and topics, and thinking about the impact that these systems have on both the people who are purchasing these systems, but also the people who are impacted ultimately by them. I've been driving the work that PwC has been doing in responsible AI globally for the past 5 years. So very excited to talk to you all more about some of that later.
Amazing. Fabulous. I'm really looking forward to learning more about that. Katya, how about yourself? I wonder if you can just give us a little bit more insight into yourself and your journey to this space.
Yeah, thanks again for having us. It's just wonderful to be again with AILA. I had an honor to come last September, so maybe some people in the audience remember that. Hello, and thank you for joining again. I'll take a step back and just say a few words about the Partnership on AI for those who maybe were not at that session. So the Partnership is a coalition of over 100 nonprofit organizations, civil society and human rights, academic institutions, and technology companies, larger and smaller, who all together work through how to put in practice the responsible AI principles that a lot of the organizations have put out there in the last 3 to 4 years. And so putting in practice such principles as making AI transparent, accountable, fair, making sure that AI serves media integrity in the media space, is supportive of safety critical applications. These are all pillars on which the partnership works. And my own pillar of work is everything that has to do with economic impact and impact on labor. So the goal of my work is make sure that AI expands access to good jobs in the broader economy, and that also, in particular, we are looking at working conditions of people who work in data supply chain. So people who label data, annotate data, content moderators, and jobs like that are spread around the world, and a lot of them are in precarious conditions, but there is just no transparency in that supply chain, no standardized reporting on the practices in it. Even though it is quite central, I think all of my fellow panelists agree that it's very central to the development process of AI models today.
Wow, Katya, thank you very much for that. And again, I'm really looking forward to learning much more about that as we go on. And lastly, Navdeep, it's a real pleasure to have you here. If you just do the honors and introduce yourself for the audience, please.
Yeah, sure. Just like to say, it's great to be here with everyone. I've never been to this conference before, but so far I've seen everything, and it's been quite wonderful. So thank you for having me. So currently I work as a lead data scientist and team lead at H2O.ai. The team I work on focuses on responsible AI. So we are sort of a combination of data scientists, product managers, engineers. What we try to achieve on this team is we try to build tools that people can use. So we know some of responsible AI cannot be sort of boiled down to a tool, but there are some components that can be. And then we try to also, let's say, do some, I don't want to say thought leadership, but we try to, write about these things and present them to customers and show them how they should approach this type of framework for the organization. So yeah, that's the team I'm on, and that's the team I lead basically, and that's what we work on. And just some of my background, I'm a data scientist by trade, so this is what I've been doing for the past 8 years or so. But my time at H2O, I've been spending a lot of time just making tools, making software that is supposed to serve data scientists. So that's the same thing we're trying to achieve now, but just with responsible AI.
It's absolutely fascinating, actually, because we've got you three wonderful people here who are looking at the same problem, but from very different angles. The different companies that you represent, different organizations that you represent, they attack the problem differently. And of course, when we do talk about responsible AI, there are so many different ways that it can be defined. But Navdeep, if we start with yourself, when you're in H2O.ai and when you're thinking about developing new products and engaging with enterprises, how do you define responsible AI, or especially working with clients, how do you explain it to them?
The way we like to explain it to them is more like a framework. So there's many definitions that are out there for responsible AI for many different companies. We try to approach it as like this kind of like this Venn diagram of this framework is what we've written about. So you have you have human-centered machine learning. So since we're a tool-making business, at least what we're in, you have to make sure that when a human interacts with your system, whatever software or whatever ML system your company has built, it's sort of catered to them. They can sort of, get in touch with it, figure out what it's doing. All these type of things should be very intuitive and very easy for them. So that's one component. Another component is you have explainable AI, which has been around for, it's been very popular in the past, 5 or more years or so. That's another component that we talk about. So you build a model, and you have to try to explain what it's doing. And this can involve, explaining to stakeholders, explaining to fellow data scientists, maybe junior level data scientists. All these type of things can encompass and explainable AI. And then with that, we also have ethical AI, which is a broad field, a broad term. But what we boil that down to sometimes, what we talk about with customers has to do with fairness. So dealing with things like disparate impact and all these type of topics, that kind of boils down to that component. We talk about secure AI, security, which is usually has to do with privacy. We talk actually about people hacking your machine learning system. We talk about that a lot. And also model debugging. That's a very big thing that we talk about as well. And then one of the other components, I guess the last one is compliance. So a lot of financial services companies have to be compliant with a lot of different laws. Same for healthcare, insurance. There's a lot of regulated industries. And what we've noticed about these industries, they already practice a lot of this stuff just because they've been doing it for years. So to them, it's sort of, yeah, we've been there, done that. But we also try to work with them to make the right tooling that they can use to make their lives easier as well. So in short, overall, to me, responsible AI is sort of this big arching framework that has many components. I can't boil it down to a paragraph or two. It's going to be just this big thing that we have to cover. So that's my definition. Yeah.
No, that's great. And Ilana, I can see you nodding your head furiously there. Would that be something? Is that something that you and the team would agree with, and that you practice yourself, or is it slightly different?
Certainly, I think there's a multitude of frameworks by which you could look at what responsible AI actually is, and some of the elements that Navdeep is highlighting, I think, certainly are in there. I'd also add the governance component, so having the organizational bodies and infrastructure in order to oversee applications. There's going to be all of the policy functions, so translating requirements into standards and procedures that might come from, from the legal side, from regulatory frameworks, but it also might come from industry standards. It might come from a desire to operate within a specific space. So there's certainly all of those elements, and then it also ties back to traditional risk management functions and other types of requirements. So I would certainly agree with what Navdeep is saying. I would also say that sometimes there's a little bit of a conflation between responsible AI and ethical AI, where, over 100 different institutions have now released their own set of ethical principles around AI. I track that just as a pet project at work. I have this really great little traceability matrix just to compare and contrast them. And ethical principles outline the different values that we think these systems should uphold. Responsible AI is how you implement them, the organizational structures. It's the processes by which you're achieving those values and the processes by which you're determining those values. So it's a little bit more expansive than ethical AI, and also a lot more tangible. And the reason why I say that is I think sometimes we get criticized here in the responsible AI space that the things that we're advocating for are intangible, that they're difficult to pin down, that there isn't one set of shared values and beliefs, but that that's not an inhibitor to actually adopting responsible AI.
And I'm interested as well, particularly Katya. Something you mentioned specifically when you were doing your introduction was the whole work that you do, particularly in the not-for-profit sector, but also dealing with vulnerable communities of people. So I'm wondering then, does your definition, or within the partnership on AI, do you think about defining responsible AI differently when you're kind of thinking about working in the public sector, or does your definition align very closely to what NEVE Deep and Ilana were saying?
Yeah, I would echo everything that has been said. For us, what is really important is in the definition what it means for each particular issue and the type of impact. The definition, in our opinion, cannot happen without the people who stand to be impacted in the room. So the communities who are vulnerable to the decisions made in that room, should be present and should participate in the dialogue that defines the requirements by which we grant someone, a stamp of being responsible. There are no such stamps, and there's very little is firmly defined in this space. But there are a lot of claims being made, and I can tell you that at least when it comes to economic impact, a lot of those claims are very empty. So people kind of picked up that it's bad to just automate, jobs away, and it's good to augment workers. And this is what you hear more and more companies saying, that they're augmenting workers. While, when you start kind of digging a little bit deeper and understand what the technology is really about, it is often about enabling exploitations through surveillance methods, for example, and, squeezing for extra productivity through really not methods that we would celebrate if they were called for what they are and not masked under a beautiful name, augmenting workers. But, that is also done in the name of kind of living up to the responsible AI, promise. So definitions matter, they lack, and they're really needed for responsible AI to become something tangible, just like Ilana was describing, and not stay in the realm of being abstract requirements that people are free to interpret however they want and execute or not. and this is something also that we are working on within the partnership on defining ways to measure the economic impact and the impact on the accessibility to good jobs of AI products and AI systems. And it is quite difficult, to like pinpoint the impact and predict it, especially when it comes to, products that have not been launched yet. Something that you would be able to introduce into your product design pipeline and think about the future economic impact. But it's really necessary to try to, find ways to make it concrete, as opposed to leave it at the level of companies saying, we want to create AI that benefits all, or we are creating AI that automates work.
I think that is particularly interesting for me, and I think it almost piggybacks something that Ilana was mentioning previously. One of the core challenges to working with enterprises on responsible AI is this criticism that we get as a community, that it's an all-encompassing term, that it's all-encompassing to the point of being vague and unhelpful. And I'm wondering, and this really kind of focuses on my next question, and Katya, I'd love to start with yourself, but I'd love you if you can not only talk about some of the main challenges that you find in working with particularly responsible AI within the public sector, but also how you've overcome them. Because I think for many people here, I think they have an idea that they're really driven by the discussions that are happening within the global responsible AI community. But I think what's brilliant about having you three here is just how have you overcome some of these challenges? So sorry, Katya, it'd be great if we could start.
Do you want me to start? Yeah, so I think we are frankly in the process of figuring out the ways to overcome that. Like, I don't think, the journey is by any stretch of imagination over, and there is a variety of sort of techniques. Sometimes there are low-hanging fruits around, inviting a structured reflection on, practices that impact people on the ground. Like, for example, the data labeling supply chain that I was mentioning before. Here, sometimes, when you talk to a product manager, someone who deals with sourcing label data sets, just like providing guidance around like inviting a reflection on the experience of the worker on the other side of the data labeling, order or like project, it really can change a lot. Because when you think about, well, is that possible for a 2 cents per label price to, at the end of the day, add up to any kind of living wage, or at least a minimum wage, if we take into account how long it takes to sustain that focused attention, to keep labeling things, to take a break, to take a lunch break. Like, if we try to take this into account, can we just work back and see if a person with the kind of task with the kind of price we're assigning per given label can live on that, right? So that sometimes can already start moving things. But then when you in our space, when we start thinking about which kind of technologies eliminate jobs and which kind of technologies are creating jobs, it gets very complex very quickly, because you need to start asking questions for what kinds of groups of workers. You might be creating new jobs, but for a very different type of workers, with very different skill requirements, and so that doesn't balance out. Or you can be creating knockoff effects throughout the economy. When, for example, you're allowing the company where the system is deployed to maybe save some costs, and get rid of some workers. But are these benefits, if there are no saved costs, are they passed on to the workers or the consumers in the form of lower prices or in the form of higher quality product? And so what we need to be careful around when we think about AI is that not always these benefits are passed on to wider society. Not always people get now a cheaper product or higher quality product, or just a new product. And if these benefits get pocketed somewhere, concentrated somewhere, where is that, and who gets to benefit and who is losing out, and how the communities that stand to lose out can be compensated or protected or helped to navigate that transition.
Navdeep, this was something actually, kind of again going on from what Katya was just saying. This was one of the big issues that I found, particularly speaking to key AI stakeholders. So, for example, just had an interview with the UN Humanitarian Affairs Department, and one of the things they said, particularly about applying AI, emerging technologies responsibly in the field, was that basically is taking it out of the ivory tower and putting it into the field. And I'm wondering, for the work that you and your team do you find similar challenges with responsible AI, from taking it from this is what we would like things to be to actually putting it on the ground and making it work in a real company, in a real environment?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge that we have is, so it's kind of, there's a challenge and then there's not so much of a challenge. So when we make our tools and we make our responsible AI type tool, if we pass it on to people in financial services, they totally get it. They totally understand what's coming out of this box. They understand how to use it, and they understand how to put it into their pipeline and present it to their stakeholders or their managers or whoever. Right. Once we start getting out of those regulated type industries, people don't really understand what the value is of this type of thing. So they're always into, say, building machine learning type models, and they look at just the metrics that you would typically look at, and that's usually enough for them. But the problem there is, the problem that we try to evoke to these people is, that's great and all, but what are you going to do when the model just goes completely wrong? Then how do you even know what will happen at that point? And that's where some accountability has to come into play. And if your system that you use to build out these models is totally chaotic and there's no way to keep track of anything, then you'll never get to the core of why something went wrong. And that's where I think responsible AI comes in. It's this type of accountability you're having at each step of the way. You're starting off making sure that people who interact with your machine learning systems are given the right set of tools to get the right amount of information that they need to move forward. You're making sure that you're giving people the ability to build interpretable models. So it's not just about building these complex black box models. You want to give them the ability to build interpretable models and teach them that it's not always about the most accurate model. Sometimes a pure linear simple model is enough to get the job done. And if something goes wrong, you'll figure out very quickly. It's a linear model. You'll look at what happened very easily and figure out what went wrong. And then, teach them about the explainability part. That's always a hard thing too, is to teach them that, these explanations are very important and they're actually deployable. Yeah. You can put those out in production and keep track of why certain decisions are made. And then another thing is, people don't understand that the model monitoring can have explainability and fairness built right into it. You can keep track of these metrics in real time. And if your system is enabled where you have this monitoring capability set up, you can, prevent yourself from dealing with a lot of harm in the future. What I try to tell people is, we can't just think financial services and healthcare and insurance are regulated. The government will start regulating many more applications of AI across many countries. As this thing just get bigger and bigger, there has to be more accountability. And we see that sometimes when you see some of the hearings at Congress in the US, and a lot of them are about artificial intelligence or these applications about privacy and things of that matter. So it's bound to happen. And we try to tell these customers who are not in these industries that, you should be ready for this. All industries will be affected, in my opinion. And this is what we try to just tell customers and keep this in mind. And if you start early enough, you'll be okay later on.
Again, absolutely fascinating, and I really wish we had more than 45 minutes to talk about this. But Ilana, again, going on from this, one of the things we're focusing on here are the challenges and how we overcome them. But from the work that you and your team do on a day-to-day basis, would you say that the clients that you speak to, or prospective or actual clients, do you find that there's almost like a knowledge or a culture gap between the understanding of almost not so much being AI first, because we hear lots of these statistics that everyone's going on that train and everyone's adopting these AI programs, and that's absolutely fine. But do you find that there are that enterprises really are very AI responsibility aware, to the extent that they understand the need for accountability, what's coming down from a policy perspective?
So I would say certainly organizations are acutely aware of the changing regulatory climate, because especially enterprises that work already in regulated spaces. Navdeep mentioned banking. Banking is not a solved issue in the responsible AI space. There's still many, many topics for them to discuss. I can talk about that probably ad nauseum at another time. The 5 primary agencies that regulate financial services for the US released an RFI about a month and a half ago, specifically asking how banks are trying to moderate for risk in their use of AI machine learning, and in fact, where they are applying AI machine learning within their enterprise. So regulatory pressure is a huge, I would say, incentive for organizations to reflect on the practices that they have at hand, and it's certainly a big driver for reflecting on their governance practices, of which very many are still quite nascent. Just going back to a few things, I mean, a lot of organizations have, yes, invested in proof of concepts, but are having an extremely difficult time scaling those proof of concepts to be deployed systems. And that's for a wide variety of reasons. One being a better knowledge about some of the risks, but also the fact that they don't necessarily have the skills to productionalize those models. They don't necessarily have the skills to sustain those models in production. They don't necessarily have the education in their traditional compliance functions like privacy and ethics, which is oftentimes a compliance function, to effectively oversee those systems. And frankly, the real world is way messier than a proof of concept environment. And so things that work really well in a small space don't really work well when generalized to broader issues. So this question of ROI is actually quite central to the topic of responsible AI as well, because if we're going to invest in these systems, if we say that they're crucial for our business operations going forward, and if we say that we want to do everything in our power to deploy them in the best way so that we'll get the most value out of them, we should also be addressing all of these other questions around who are they impacting, around how do we think these systems should operate, around how do we think they should be governed, because they're really, you can't separate those issues. And one thing I will say about, well, I'll kind of add 2 more things. And individual functional groups within enterprises do still think these topics are really important and are trying to solve them in their own way, which is also kind of a problem, because that means that there are divergent practices that will be emerging within the same organization, and you very well will miss out on a lot of potential risk. So data science teams might see some of these tools coming out to market that are saying that it's really great. Let's add, Navdeep, I think H2O AI is amazing. Let's add some explainability. Let's add some bias testing to that. But what are the actual requirements for bias of the system? We might not know. What are the requirements for explainability? Who do you need to explain it to? What's a sufficient explanation? That has to come from the business side. That has to come down from the standards and the policies that are produced at the organizational level. And these teams need to talk better, because otherwise they end up doing things differently. And then our appreciation of risks and of ethical topics and ethical imperatives changes with time. A few years ago, this question about ghost labor and who is actually annotating our data, that was something that only a small number of us were even talking about. It's a much more prominent topic now, because people are becoming much more aware that there are other people involved in this data supply chain, and we need to address those topics. Or these huge models that we're building have significant sustainability implications. Do we need to be building that? Is that an ethical imperative for us as well to address those topics? So we're never really going to be able to fully solve responsible AI. It's an ongoing, you have to think of it as like a muscle that we're building for organizations so that they can become more aware of topics and adjust and take feedback and modify practices as we go.
Perfect. I do have some other questions, but I'm also really keen to give the audience an opportunity to ask some of our panelists any questions that they may have. So, so Todd, I'm not sure how this will work, but if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask our panelists, then now would be a great time to do that. Okay, go to Q&A. Okay, so wow, so we do have a few questions here. We have a few questions here for the panel. So I'm going to direct these at all of you. But but first of all, we've got a question from Brandy, who says we've seen a rise in the use of AI or algorithmic risk assessments to mitigate harms from AI. How are human rights being integrated into these assessment tools, and are they effective? So Navdeep, I'd like to. Why don't we start with yourself?
Let's see. I'm not actually. I don't. I'm trying to think of an answer to this one.
Or I'll open the floor. Not put you on the spot.
So I mean, yeah. So the AI, yeah, risk assessment tools. There's plenty of them around to kind of look at the harms of AI and things like that. But when it comes to human rights issues or anything of that matter, I think these tools are trying to be integrated, but I feel like they could be a little risky to integrate something like that. Like these, risk tools. If I understand correctly, maybe an example is sort of the Compass issue that happened some time ago with the whole recidivism. That was a risk assessment tool that was basically put out into the wild and not really monitored after that, and that's a shame because it caused a lot of issues for a lot of people. So that is something where the tool was made in good nature. It was good intentions. But at the same time, you have to keep the human in the loop to sort of keep those risk assessments working adequately. It's not enough just to use that tool to make an answer and go with it. There has to be some human in the loop. And that's usually the same across all fronts. I don't think there'll ever be, there shouldn't be an automation to any of this stuff. So the risk assessment can help, and it can be integrated into these tools, but you always need a human in the loop to keep track of it.
That's interesting. And Katya, for yourself, that the same question about AI and algorithmic risk assessment tools and human rights.
Yeah, for the risk assessment tools that I'm familiar with, and maybe our audience can send me their favorite ones, but the ones I know, I don't think they sufficiently integrate human rights because, for example, the economic rights are not integrated anywhere, and economic rights are human rights. Right to work is a human right. And so none of the tools that I'm familiar with, they try to track the broader economic impact and the so-called general equilibrium effect on the economy, on the availability of jobs, on whether jobs are getting worse, more intense, more surveilled with the introduction of those tools, and what happens to the total amount of jobs in the economy and the wages prevailing in the economy because of the introduction of that tool. The tool, granted that the risk assessment tool like that would be very, very difficult to build, but something we would need to, just because it's hard to measure something, doesn't mean that excuses us from trying to think about those consequences nevertheless.
Yeah, I agree with that. So a lot of risk assessments they're intended to be quite minimal, just a handful of questions to really bifurcate risk so that it mostly it's to try and triage. So certain models go through different governance processes. That's usually how risk assessments are used. What I would say the complement to that is, and Katya, to your point, are other types of approaches that are almost more game or workshop oriented, so that you can think through different people's perspectives with respect to the same application and the different challenges that they might face, or that we could anticipate that they might face with that particular application. That's a great way to try and expose some of these other issues that just don't come out as explicitly within a really minimal risk assessment process. So not to call any particular one out, but Microsoft has a game called Judgment Call, where you play different people within the same algorithmic system. And I think it's those types of games are really good to help you think outside of your specific box.
Fascinating. There are a few other questions just here at the moment, and I think the one that's got the most thumbs up at the moment is this one from Ramsey, who asks, what are the biggest blockers for companies to implement responsible AI right now? So Ilana, why don't I'll start with yourself.
It's probably different for different organizations. I would say Some organizations are at a place where they are trying to figure out what doing the right thing means for them and how that translates to practices. So again, that comes back to governance, as I keep saying. There's another lens here where we have all of these regulatory frameworks that are imminent, and some organizations might be tempted to wait for these regulations to pass so that others can help them define what these practices mean, given that there are many options. Take your choice of what responsible AI flavor you could potentially adopt. So I think that is a bit of a challenge, or I would say a temptation to wait and be told what to do.
Right. How about yourself, Navdeep? What would you say are some of the biggest blockers to companies implementing responsible AI now?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest blockers might be, well, first, if they're a little too new to what this is, or there's not really someone in the organization that can explain to them what it is, it might be a little difficult to get everything up and going. I also think it comes down to their understanding of risk. So if they understand, what risk is at play with some type of use case that they're trying to solve. If they can't understand the risk, then the use of responsible AI is usually, I think, risk is a big component of that. You're trying to understand, like, if something went wrong, why did it go wrong, and what can I do to fix it? If you don't understand the risk going into a use case, then it's sort of open-ended. The risk can go in many different directions, and you have no idea where it's going to go. So I think that is what can block, I say, a company when it comes to responsible AI. You have to understand the risk before you start practicing any of these things. And once you understand the risk, then this framework is more approachable. I also think that some companies are probably doing components of responsible AI, so they might not be doing the whole thing, but they're doing components of it. So, there could be a company out there that's just doing explanations, which is great. It's not in everything, but there's people who are doing nothing. So this is better than nothing. So I do think there's companies doing components of it. And maybe there's companies out there trying to achieve the entire spectrum. But, of course, it's going to be tough to try to achieve every single thing in one shot. It will take a lot of iteration.
Absolutely. And Katya, I've got another question that I'd love to pose to you. I think we're almost at time, but this question, which goes along the lines of, should we expect non-European regulators to roll out meaningful laws around AI anytime soon? What would your answer be to that?
I think they will, and that's a great thing, because a lot of really interesting laws I think are coming around from around the world, and regulatory experimentation is very much needed here. It's really hard to expect one regulator to just get it right. I think especially when it comes to how data is handled, how it's collected, what is it used for in the workplace, which is the area that I work on. It's difficult to even wrap your head around how to regulate that space. And so it's great that more and more people are looking into this. And then also probably antitrust regulation is going to become relevant. There's going to be an overlap between the antitrust regulation and AI regulation. And there is just a growing wave of those cases in the US as well. So a lot more is going to be happening, I think, around the world, not just in Europe, but Europe is, as usual, has been leading the way there. And also, I want to, just take a few seconds to underscore what Navdeep said around responsible AI being a practice. It's not something you've implemented and you forget about it, and you're done. You're never done. I think Ilana also spoke about that in the beginning. So I would phrase the question from someone in the audience a little bit differently, what stops companies from beginning to stepping on that journey and reflecting deeply on their practices and becoming more responsible. And I think what stands between those who are doing nothing, as Navdeep said, and who are trying to improve their practices is really the decision to begin this work. And hopefully, thanks to events like today's, there are going to be more and more people who make that decision.
That's perfect. That's perfect. And I think we are just about at time. So Ilana, Navdeep, and Katya, thanks so much for being here and being part of this panel. I really, really wish it could go on for a lot longer, but thank you so much for being here and being part of this symposium. It's been invaluable having your perspectives. Just before we do go, I wonder if we can just go around and if you can let people know where the best place is to connect with you if they want to after this event. So I haven't said it. So Katya, why don't we start? Katya, why don't we start with yourself? Where's the best place for people to connect?
Yeah, I'm easy to find on like Twitter, LinkedIn, Katya Klinova. You can also email me, katya@partnership.onai.org. And Lawrence, thank you so much for hosting this conversation.
You're very welcome. How about yourself, Ilana? Where's the best place to get in touch with you?
Same thing, Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm pretty discoverable and always happy to chat with anybody who wants to. And this was a really, really great panel. So thank you.
And finally, Navdeep, how about yourself? Where's the best place for people to get in touch with you?
Exactly. Same. Twitter, LinkedIn, everything the same. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you all very much again. Thank you for being a part of this wonderful symposium. And Todd, I'll give the floor back to yourself.